As we begin this quiet journey together, take a moment to settle into a comfortable position. Let the soft rhythm of your breathing slow down as we drift gently into a story that stretches across continents, centuries, and myths. Tonight's exploration is not one of excitement or dramatic revelations. Instead, it is a slow, soothing walk through an old corner of history, one that has been whispered about, misunderstood, and often imagined into something far more mysterious than it ever claimed to be. Just allow yourself to relax as we step into a gentle landscape of old maps, forgotten names, and wide, silent plains that once stretched across the northern world. The story of Tartaria, or Tartary as it was often written, isn't a tale with a clear beginning or a definitive end. It's more like a foggy memory that humanity once held, an idea scribbled into the margins of early atlases, mentioned briefly in the diaries of travelers, and mapped on parchment with sweeping strokes that covered everything beyond the familiar. There is something strangely peaceful about this uncertainty, as if the vagueness itself invites calm contemplation. Tartaria is an echo, not a declaration, a name for a place that may never have truly existed as a single entity, yet lingered long enough to become something mythic in the collective imagination. As the world slept through centuries of slow geographic discovery, scholars, sailors, and storytellers filled blank spaces on their maps with names that sounded exotic and distant. Tartaria became one of those names, a vast region that stretched over such a large area that it became almost symbolic, less a nation and more a placeholder for everything unknown and uncharted. The comfort of this old idea lies in its simplicity. Instead of precise borders and defined cultures, Tartaria offered wide open space, the kind that allows the mind to wander softly, without urgency or constraint. Tonight, as we drift through the story, imagine ancient mapmakers hunched over candlelit tables. They dipped quills into ink and traced coastlines they had never personally seen, filling the interior of continents with gentle curves and uncertain mountains. The land they called Tartary spanned from the distant edges of Eastern Europe to the mysterious territories beyond Siberia. These regions were too far for most to travel, too wild to categorize accurately, and too sparsely documented to be drawn confidently. And in that uncertainty, the idea of Tartaria expanded like a dream. It became a comfortable answer to the unknown, a single word that could represent everything beyond the reach of familiar civilizations. There is a calming stillness in the image of those old worlds. Picture broad plains covered in tall, whispering grasses. Picture slow-moving herds, camps that dotted riverbanks, and winds that carried stories more than written records. People who lived in these lands didn't think of themselves as part of something called Tartaria. They belonged to their tribes, their clans, their small communities. Yet from far away, behind desks and maps in foreign languages, the world looked at them as a collective mystery. One region, one name, one vast, undefined space. Let your mind rest on that quiet contrast, the difference between how people saw themselves and how others imagined them. History is full of such contrasts, especially in older centuries where communication traveled no faster than the speed of a walking horse. This gentle gap between reality and imagination is what gave Tartaria its shape, not through battles or kings or monuments, but through the absence of detail. Where there was silence, a story formed. Where there was distance, an idea grew. And where there was a blank space on a map, the name Tartaria was softly written. As we continue, let the slow unfolding of this ancient concept ease you further into calmness. There is no need to rush or to hold on to any detail too tightly. This is a story meant for drifting thoughts, where the goal is not to analyze but to gently observe. Think of the people who live in these remote lands, waking to the quiet sounds of nature around them, the crunch of frost beneath their feet in winter, the warm hum of summer winds crossing the plains, the soft glow of campfires lighting the nights. Their world moved at a pace that encouraged patience. And as we move through their history tonight, you're invited to adopt that same tranquil tempo. This first part of our journey is simply an invitation to relax into the soft mystery of a name that held countless meanings over time. Tartaria was never a kingdom with a golden throne, never a unified empire with a single story. Instead, it was a label born from distance and curiosity, an old word used to describe the edges of the world before those edges were fully understood. And in this uncertainty, there is a peaceful sort of beauty, A reminder that not everything in history needs to be sharp or clear to be meaningful. As you breathe a little slower, let the image of ancient maps drift across your mind: vast snowy lands, rolling hills, unknown forests, and gently sketched borders that fade into open space. These quiet landscapes are where our journey begins, not with conflict or noise, but with the soft simplicity of the unknown. And as we move forward, that calm rhythm will continue, guiding you deeper into the slow-moving tale of a land both real and imagined, a place whose history is more like a bedtime story than a strict record of events. When we speak of Tartaria, we aren't referring to a single moment in time or a clearly defined civilization, but rather to a drifting idea that changed gently as centuries roll by. It is a word that once appeared in the quiet corners of old dictionaries, the blank stretches of forgotten maps, and the scattered journals of explorers who wandered across the vast northern regions of Asia. Even though the name has faded from modern geography, its echo remains soft and persistent, like a distant breeze that carries faint traces of a world people once imagined with wonder and uncertainty. Tonight, we slowly explore what Tartaria meant, not through rigid definitions, but through the shapes of stories and perceptions that surrounded it. Imagine for a moment how different the world once was, how slow information traveled, how limited people's understanding of distant lands could be. A traveler might journey for months across unfamiliar terrain, and even after returning home, their memories would be recounted gently, shaped by time, exhaustion, and the natural haze of storytelling. As these stories passed from one person to another, small details blurred, and vague impressions solidified into shared beliefs. Tartaria grew out of that blur, forming not from one civilization, but from the merging of countless scattered accounts, each incomplete on its own, but together creating a soft outline of something vast and mysterious. The word itself drifted into European languages from older forms used by medieval chroniclers. To them, Tartars or Tatars, as they were more accurately known, were people from the distant steppes, tribes who moved freely across open, wind-swept landscapes. Over time, the name expanded beyond its original meaning, stretching like a watercolor wash across everything east of the Urals and north of the Great Wall of China. The land it referred to was immense, too immense to be understood precisely, so the name became a convenient symbol for the unknown. In old atlases, it appears confidently printed across enormous regions, yet the confidence was an illusion. The truth was that map-makers simply didn't know what lay beyond the boundaries of the familiar world, and the name Tartaria filled that silence with a single word. There is a certain calmness in acknowledging how human understanding grows, not all at once, but slowly, like a sunrise spreading across a quiet landscape. Tartaria represents that early stage of understanding, where the light is still dim and the edges of the world are hard to see. Early geographers did not intend to mislead anyone. They simply worked with the limited information available to them. They gathered stories from travelers, scribbled notes from merchants, fragmented descriptions from diplomats, and they tried, with patience and hope, to form a picture that made sense. The result was never perfect, but it was enough to suggest the existence of a distant, expansive region filled with numerous, diverse peoples. As we drift through this peaceful narrative, imagine how the word must have sounded to those who lived far from the steppes. Tartaria likely conjured images of snow-covered forests, endless plains, and nomadic riders who moved like shadows under the wide northern sky. It was a world that seemed both real and unreal at the same time, a place that existed on maps, but remained untouched by the vast majority of those who read about it. The unfamiliarity gave it a dreamlike quality, a gentle separation from the everyday world, making it feel almost like a geographical lullaby whispered across the centuries. Those who tried to describe Tartaria often did so with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. They wrote about its great distances, its shifting tribes, and the fluid boundaries that made it difficult to categorize. Their words painted impressions rather than details, like soft brushstrokes rather than the sharp lines we expect from modern geography. In this way, Tartaria became a story carried across time, an ever-changing idea shaped by perspectives of those who attempted to make sense of what they did not fully know. There is also a subtle beauty in the vagueness of historical labels like this. They remind us that knowledge evolves, and that what seems mysterious today may become clear tomorrow. When we think of Tartaria now, we think of the echoes it left behind in cartography, folklore, and mythology rather than a concrete empire. These echoes are gentle and unobtrusive, allowing us to enjoy the quiet space where history and imagination blend softly together. For many modern listeners, especially those seeking sleep or peace, this blending offers a soothing sense of old-world distance, a calm drift into forgotten stories that once shaped the human understanding of geography. Picture again the map makers of the past, working late into the night. Their candles flicker as they sketch coastlines and mountain ranges based on fragments of information. In their minds, the lands they labeled as Tartaria are not empty or lifeless. They are simply unknown. And the unknown, especially in earlier centuries, was not a source of fear, but one of curiosity and wonder. People imagine these lands as places of ancient traditions, unusual customs, and resilient cultures shaped by harsh winters and sweeping landscapes. The lack of certainty allowed the imagination to roam freely, creating a soft, dreamy outline that modern interpretations often struggle to recapture. As you relax into this story, let the name Tartaria float in your thoughts like a gentle cloud drifting across a pale sky. There is no need to define it sharply or to assign it a precise meaning. Instead, allow it to remain what it has always been, a word that hints at vastness, at distance, at something quietly beyond the horizon. Its existence in historical texts is not a declaration of a single civilization, but rather a reflection of how people once perceived the edges of their world. And in that perception, there is a certain tranquility, a slow rhythm that invites rest rather than analysis. By understanding Tartaria not as a factual empire, but as a fluid, evolving concept, you can appreciate the calmness that accompanies its story. It teaches us that not everything needs clarity to possess meaning, and not every name needs borders to evoke a sense of place. Sometimes, the most soothing histories are the ones that leave gentle spaces for the imagination to wander. And as you breathe softly and sink deeper into relaxation, this unfolding idea of Tartaria becomes a quiet companion, guiding your thoughts across distant lands where the past whispers rather than shouts, and where history drifts like a calm breeze across the sleeping world. Long before satellite images revealed the precise contours of continents, the world was a canvas of uncertainty. Early map makers worked not with direct observation, but with stories, rumors, and scattered pieces of information carried across deserts and seas. Their parchment sheets were vast, their ink strokes deliberate, and their understanding limited by the edges of the known world. Into these open spaces, they carefully placed shapes and symbols, not always because they were accurate, but because a map needed fullness, a sense of order, even when the truth was far from complete. And on these maps, spread across the northern expanse of Asia, the word Tartary quietly appeared, stretching like a calm shadow over everything the cartographer could not yet clearly define. Imagine a dimly lit workshop in the early centuries of cartography. Wooden tables creak under the weight of rolled parchments. Candle wax drips slowly, forming soft pools of light on the work surface. The map maker leans over his drawing, quill in hand, try and make sense of the stories that have reached him from lands he will never see. Merchants have described long plains that seem to stretch endlessly. Travelers have spoken of cold winds that sweep over distant horizons. Diplomats and adventurers mention tribes, languages, and landscapes, yet their descriptions contradict one another. Still, the map maker must draw something. And so, he dips his quill and sketches wide shapes, unbroken territories, and unfamiliar borders. For the northern world, the name he writes, Tartaria, helps him complete the picture. In that age, the map served not just as a tool for travelers, but as a calming assurance to those who gaze upon it. People found comfort in believing that the world had edges, that the blank spaces were part of something, even if they didn't fully understand it. The presence of Tartaria on a map was not an attempt to deceive. It was an attempt to bring order to the unknown. It offered a gentle illusion of completeness, a label that soothed the anxious curiosity of a world still discovering itself. There is something serene in the way these early maps balance fact and imagination. Coastlines were drawn with confidence where ships had sailed, but inland regions faded into guesswork. A mountain range might be added based on a traveler's passing mention, while a great river could be placed simply because it seemed logical for a waterway to flow in that direction. In these quiet artistic choices, Tartaria took shape, boundless, vague, and softly defined. Its very vagueness became its identity. As you picture these ancient maps, Let your mind drift across their gentle imperfections. Their parchment tones are warm and muted, their lines uneven, their labels written in fonts that now feel old enough to soothe the senses. The region we know today as Siberia, Mongolia, northern China, and Central Asia appears as one enormous expanse with minimal detail. Instead of cities and precise borders, the map contains decorative drawings, small sketches of mountains, forests, or mythical creatures placed wherever information was thin. This blending of reality and artistry created a peaceful sense of distance, a world softened by uncertainty. For those who lived far from these mysterious lands, the idea of Tartaria became comforting in its consistency. Even if the details were unclear, the mapmakers always placed it in roughly the same region, a dependable presence on the northern edge of the world. Travelers might return with tales of tribes and rivers, but the overarching label remained the same. It was easier, and perhaps gentler, to keep the vastness unified under one name rather than attempting to untangle the complex mosaic of cultures, languages, and lands that truly existed there. The contrast between known and unknown regions on early maps played an important role in shaping how Tartaria was perceived. Western Europe, with its dense cities and established trade routes, was drawn with precision. The Mediterranean coastline curved confidently across the page. The familiar lands were detailed and neatly divided, but as the mapmaker's quill traveled eastward, details became sparse. Borders blurred. Shapes grew larger, less defined, more dreamlike. The transition was not abrupt. It was gradual and calming, as though the world slowly drifted into a mist. And within that mist, the word Tartaria rested peacefully, offering a soft explanation for everything not yet understood. It's easy to imagine a curious observer in those centuries leaning over one of these maps. Their eyes follow the coastlines they recognize. They trace the mountains they have read about in books. And then, as they reach the far land of Asia, their finger hovers over the wide, open region labeled Tartaria. Perhaps they imagined snow-covered plains. Perhaps they pictured sprawling forests or silent deserts. Perhaps they pictured nomads traveling through the night under a sky filled with stars. The word was like a portal into quiet imagination, a soothing reminder that the world was larger than anyone's immediate experience. Even when new information arrived from distant expeditions, mapmakers incorporated it slowly, carefully, and sometimes reluctantly. After all, a map was not just a factual document. It was a visual harmony, a balance of shapes and spaces. Changing one part meant adjusting many others, and in the delicate art of cartography, this required patience. So Tartaria remained for centuries, gently shifting in size but never disappearing, always present as a calm constant amid changing knowledge. As the centuries progressed, more detailed explorations slowly chipped away at the blankness. Rivers were charted more accurately. Mountain ranges were identified by name. The names of tribes and regions began to fill the once empty spaces. Yet, for a long time, the overarching label still held. Even as understanding deepened, the old habit remained, a single word representing an entire stretch of the world. There is a peaceful message in the slow unraveling of the unknown. History reminds us that understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It comes softly in gentle waves, the way twilight gradually brightens into dawn. Tartaria was part of that twilight, a soothing transition between imagined geography and documented reality. And even now, when we look back at those old maps, the quiet presence of that name can evoke a sense of nostalgia for a time when the world felt larger, softer, and filled with mysteries whispered rather than explained.
When we think of the vast northern steppes, stretching endlessly across Eurasia, it helps to imagine a landscape where the horizon never truly ends. The sky meets the earth in a soft, unbroken line, and the wind moves freely, carrying with it the quiet stories of countless generations. Long before modern nations existed, these plains were the home of diverse peoples whose lives followed the rhythm of nature rather than the borders drawn by distant rulers. To understand the roots of the idea later called Tartaria, we must slowly drift through the histories of the nomads, tribes, and empires that once traveled these open lands. The steppe has always been a place of movement. For thousands of years, people lived here not by building thick stone walls but by following their herds across the seasons. They traveled lightly, relying on horses for speed, strength, and companionship. From a distance, their camps might have looked temporary, but their culture was deeply rooted in these shifting landscapes. Imagine waking each morning to the soft crunch of frost under hooves, the gentle snort of horses preparing for the day, and the low hum of families tending fires for their first warm drink. This was the rhythm of steppe life, simple, cyclical, and shaped by the environment more than by politics. Among the earliest of these groups were the Scythians, known to ancient civilizations for their skill in archery and mastery of horseback travel. Greek writers describe them with a mixture of admiration and mystery, painting them as fierce yet noble inhabitants of a distant world. Their existence contributed to an early European perception of the northern lands as home to powerful nomadic societies, capable of immense mobility and independence. Yet the Scythians themselves never thought of their world as mythic. To them, the endless grasslands were simply home. As centuries passed, new groups emerged, the Huns, Avars, Turks, and later the Mongols, each leaving subtle traces on the evolving mosaic of the steppe. These societies were not static. They grew, mingled, shifted, and sometimes disappeared entirely from the written record, leaving behind only fragments of pottery, scattered burial mounds, and whispered legends. To the people who observed these movements from far away, the picture became unclear. They could see that powerful forces lived beyond the horizon, but they couldn't define them clearly. This lack of clarity contributed to the formation of the vast, generalized label that Europeans eventually called Tartaria. One of the most significant cultures to shape the perception of these lands was the Turkic world. Their languages, traditions, and trade networks spread across a broad region. They created khanates, political groups centered around a ruling khan, that rose and fell over centuries. These khanates weren't empires in the way Europeans imagined. Their boundaries shifted with alliances, migrations, and seasons. When traders passed through and carried their stories back west, the details changed slightly with each retelling. Over time, these descriptions merged softly into one another, giving the impression of a single, large, mysterious people from the north. The nomadic lifestyle itself added to the mystery. Unlike settled civilizations with permanent cities and monumental architecture, the people of the steppes built homes designed to move with them. Their felt tents, called jers or yurts, were warm in winter and cool in summer, crafted with materials from the land. To an outsider, this mobility made it difficult to understand their world. A traveler could pass through one region and see a large encampment buzzing with life, only to return months later and find empty plains where no trace of that community remained. This fluidity, while practical for nomads, made it nearly impossible for early cartographers and chroniclers to map accurately. And then, of course, came the rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, a moment when the steppe peoples briefly unified under one of the most powerful forces in world history. The Mongol armies moved with a speed and coordination that startled neighboring civilizations. Their empire stretched across continents, connecting Europe and Asia through trade, diplomacy, and sometimes conflict. To many Europeans, the Mongols were simply the Tartars, an extension of the vague term used for northern peoples. Even though the Mongols had their own identities, languages, and political structures, the unfamiliarity of their world led outsiders to fold them into the larger label of Tartaria. Yet the Mongol Empire itself did not last in its original form. It fractured into smaller khanates, each taking on its own character. These successor states continued to shape the identity of the steppe region long after the empire's decline, blending cultures from Persia, China, Russia, and Central Asia. Again, the complexity of these societies was far beyond what distant scribes could fully explain. So the name persisted, Tartaria, a soft, simplifying word that wrapped countless cultures into a single idea. When we imagine these ancient peoples, it's important to picture their daily lives with a sense of calm and respect. Life on the steppe was harsh at times, but also deeply connected to nature. Herds of horses grazed freely, their movements forming patterns across the landscape. Families cooked over open fires, their meals simple and nourishing. Children learned to ride before they could fully speak, growing up with a sense of balance and freedom that matched the openness of their environment. Nights were spent under skies filled with stars brighter than anything visible in modern cities, and stories were passed from elders to children through gentle voices and long traditions. These lived experiences rarely appeared in written form. Instead, outsiders saw only glimpses, travel accounts, military reports, second-hand descriptions from merchants and diplomats. These glimpses formed the shadow of an idea, one that eventually grew into the broad, indistinct label Europeans would use, Tartaria. To the people of the steppe, the name meant little. They identified with their clans, their tribes, their local histories. But from afar, the impression became unified, and the steppes were perceived as a single, mysterious region filled with wandering peoples whose stories were hard to categorize. In this way, the mythic image of Tartaria slowly grew out of real cultures, vibrant, diverse, and constantly moving. They shaped the identity of the northern world not through grand monuments, but through the quiet persistence of their traditions. And as we drift deeper into this story, let the gentle rhythm of their journeys guide your imagination across the soft plains, where history blends peacefully with myth and the past drifts like a calm wind across an endless horizon. As we drift further into the quiet narrative of these northern lands, the world transitions into a time when medieval explorers and chroniclers attempted to describe places that lay far beyond the boundaries of the familiar. In their journals and letters, written under dim candlelight in distant inns or aboard rocking ships, they recorded impressions that were often shaped more by imagination than by accuracy. What they saw, what they heard, and what they believed, all mixed gently together to form pictures of lands that seemed mystical and unreachable. The northern kingdoms they wrote about were never fully understood, but their descriptions helped cement the early foundations of what Europeans would later call Tartaria. To imagine this era, allow your thoughts to slow down and settle into the soft setting of the Middle Ages. Picture a monk in a quiet scriptorium, hunched over a heavy wooden desk. Outside, a cold wind rattles the shutters, but inside, the room is warm from the glow of several flickering candles. He is copying the travel notes of explorers who journeyed through Asia, their stories winding through the parchment like rivers through unfamiliar soil. Some of these stories describe fierce warriors riding under wide, open skies. Others speak of peaceful tribes living in harmony with their animals and land. The monk does not know which details are true, but he copies each one with care, trusting that they contain at least fragments of reality. These early travelers often struggled to understand the cultures they encountered. Language barriers, shifting alliances, and unfamiliar customs made it difficult to form clear impressions. A traveler might see a camp filled with tents and assume it was temporary, not knowing it had been in the same region for years. Another might meet a group of riders and believe they belonged to a single tribe, unaware that they came from different families and spoke different dialects. Every tale contained elements of truth, but each one was shaped by the perspective of the person telling it. And when these tales traveled across continents, passed from one storyteller to another, small uncertainties grew into larger mysteries. One of the most famous medieval travelers, Marco Polo, wrote about northern Asia with a mixture of curiosity and wonder. His descriptions included kingdoms with shifting borders, dynasties that rose and fell, and vast remote areas where the silence stretched longer than any path. Although he tried to be precise, even his words sometimes blurred details together, for he too was navigating lands where cultures blended and landscapes felt infinite. To readers in Europe, these accounts were both fascinating and confusing, suggesting that the northern world was a place of innumerable tribes and hidden kingdoms. This impression, though subtle, fed into the larger concept of a vast region beyond complete comprehension. The medieval Christian world also viewed these distant lands through a spiritual lens. Some chroniclers imagined them as places of danger, home to people who lived at the edge of the known world, where the familiar rules of society and religion did not apply. Others saw them as lands of possibility, places where ancient traditions had survived untouched. Both perspectives contributed to a sense of mystery, one that softened and enlarged the idea of Northern Asia until it became a single imagined kingdom rather than a collection of diverse regions. During this time, European maps began to show the northern world as a broad sweep of territory, interrupted only by the occasional mountain range or river. Instead of labeling each tribe or region, cartographers often used a single name to cover it all. This name varied over time, but as centuries passed, the label that stood out most prominently was that of Tartary. It appeared gently across the top of the map, stretching over lands so little understood that even the mapmakers themselves knew their knowledge was incomplete. Still, the word provided a sense of order, a way to fill the space without leaving it blank. Travelers returning from long expeditions reported mixed impressions of the people they encountered. Some spoke of nomadic warriors who moved swiftly and skillfully across the steppe. Others described quiet families living simple, peaceful lives close to nature. These impressions seemed contradictory, but they reflected the diversity of the region. For those hearing the stories back home, however, it was easier to merge all these accounts into a single narrative. This gentle merging of identities and cultures helped shape the medieval belief that there existed one vast northern kingdom populated by mysterious peoples whose ways were unlike any found in settled Europe. In medieval literature, these ideas took on an almost dreamlike quality. Storytellers embroidered details, adding dramatic storms, hidden palaces, and ancient rulers with long-forgotten names. They described forests so dense that daylight barely reached the ground and plains so wide that travelers could ride for days without seeing a single settlement. These embellishments were not meant to deceive but to reflect the awe and curiosity people felt when imagining lands beyond their reach. Over time, the shadowy kingdoms of the north became part of folklore as much as history. Another important influence on the perception of these northern lands came from the fear of the unknown. Medieval societies often interpreted unfamiliar cultures through the lens of their own beliefs, and when those cultures differed greatly, misunderstanding followed. A simple ritual might be misinterpreted as something mystical. A unique style of clothing might be viewed as a sign of strangeness. These misunderstandings traveled long distances, gaining weight along the way, eventually contributing to the aura of mystery surrounding the steppe peoples. And yet, amid all the uncertainty and imagination, there was a kind of tranquility in how the northern world was portrayed. The vastness of the land was often described in poetic terms: endless fields of grass, soft winds that whispered across the plains, starry skies that seemed closer to the earth. These descriptions, though vague, gave the region a timeless, almost peaceful quality. The people who lived there were seen as both fierce and serene, shaped by the openness of their environment. As these medieval accounts accumulated over generations, they gradually formed a fabric of impressions, some accurate, some imagined, woven together loosely yet persistently. This fabric became the backdrop for the idea of Tartaria, a place that existed more in the realm of perception than concrete historical reality. It was a projection of curiosity, distance, and the human inclination to fill blank spaces with stories. And as we drift from this medieval world into the next stage of our exploration, the soft echo of those early chronicles remains, guiding us gently into the continued evolution of the Tartarian idea. When the world looks back on the steppes of Central and Northern Asia, one moment rises gently above the others, a period when the rhythms of nomadic life aligned under a single, powerful force. This was the rise of the Mongol Empire, a chapter of history often described in terms of conquest and speed, but when viewed through a softer lens, it becomes a story of movement, adaptation, and the shaping of landscapes that once seemed endless. Even though the Mongols left a profound mark on the world, their name was frequently folded by outsiders into the broader label that Europeans used for these vast territories: Tartary. To understand why, it helps to look at the Mongol expansion not with urgency, but with a calm awareness of how history slowly transforms perception. To imagine the early days of this rising empire, picture a world of open skies and rolling plains. A young Temujin, who would later be known as Genghis Khan, rode across these expanses long before anyone imagined the heights he would reach. His life was shaped by the quiet hardships of the steppe, cold mornings where frost clung to the grass, warm evenings settled around a family fire, and constant awareness of nature's shifting moods. The steppe did not offer comfort easily, but it taught resilience, unity, and the art of reading the land with attentive patience. The Mongols' way of life gave them a sense of mobility that few civilizations possessed. Their horses were swift and sturdy, Their families traveled with them, and their shelter could be taken down and rebuilt in a matter of hours. From the outside, this mobility seemed mysterious and even frightening, but from within their culture, it was simply the natural rhythm of existence. When their influence began to spread, the rest of the world viewed it through fragmented stories and incomplete reports, leading to a mixture of awe and uncertainty. As the Mongols expanded under Genghis Khan's leadership, word of their movements reached faraway lands in waves, some accurate, some exaggerated, and some shaped by the fear of the unfamiliar. Europeans who heard of them saw only swift armies, unknown languages, and a vast northern force. They did not see the everyday life behind these armies, the tender rituals of family, the careful training of horses, the songs shared across distances, the deep respect for the natural world. These details were lost, replaced by a single, simple label. To outsiders, the Mongols became Tartars, woven into the same broad imagination that had long painted the northern world with a single brush. But the Mongol Empire was more complex than any one label could capture. Beneath their swift expansion were intricate systems of leadership, communication, and diplomacy. Their couriers traveled astonishing distances, linking major regions of the world with a network of roads and relay stations that carried messages with remarkable speed. Their tolerance of diverse religions created an atmosphere where many cultures could coexist peacefully. And their administrative skills helped stabilize regions that had previously been divided. Like all empires, theirs had moments of conflict and hardship, but it also brought unexpected connections between far-flung parts of the world. Yet the Europeans who recorded these events often focused on the parts they did not understand. They wrote about unstoppable armies appearing from the horizon like a sudden storm. They described battles, rumors of supernatural strength, and sweeping movements across landscapes they had never seen themselves. In the process, the nuanced reality of Mongol governance blurred, replaced by an image of a mysterious northern power. And so, in the minds of many, the Mongols merged softly into Tartaria, becoming another layer of the great, undefined world that lay beyond familiar borders. As the empire reached its height, its territory stretched from Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan, from Siberia to the edges of Persia and India. The sheer scale of this expanse reinforced the idea that the northern world was unified under one vast force. Even as the empire later fractured into separate khanates, European maps continued to show the region under the same broad label. These maps were not maliciously inaccurate. They simply reflected the limited vision of the time. When a place was too large, too distant, or too diverse to fully understand, a single name felt easier, calmer, and more manageable. The people living within the empire, however, experienced a very different reality. Their days were shaped by the rhythms of work, travel, and community. Children grew up learning how to ride horses almost as soon as they could walk. Herds grazed peacefully in the background of everyday life. Stories were passed down through gentle oral traditions, often accompanied by simple instruments and melodies carried across the wind. The harshness of the steppe existed alongside deep warmth within families and tribes. Travelers who moved through Mongol-controlled territory often wrote about the surprising order they encountered. Roads were safer than they had been in generations, markets bustled with goods from distant lands, and communication between cultures grew easier. However, these positive impressions were not enough to counter the older, more dramatic tales that had already taken hold in Europe. And so the image remained, a shadowy northern power, vast and undefined, part reality and part imagination. The decline of the Mongol Empire did not immediately erase this image. Even as territories broke apart and new powers emerged, the older perceptions lingered in the minds of mapmakers and historians. The land still felt immense and mysterious. Its people still seemed too varied to categorize. And so the name Tartaria continued to drift across maps, preserving a sense of unity that the land itself no longer held. In a quiet way, the story of the Mongol Empire's rise and legacy shows how history can become softened, smoothed, and simplified over time. A civilization that once operated with remarkable structure and intention became, in the eyes of distant observers, merely part of the unknown north. Through misunderstanding, distance, and limited communication, A powerful empire transformed into a portion of a mythic region. As you reflect on this transformation, let the gentle contrast settle into your thoughts. What was once real became partly imagined. What was once detailed became blurred. And within that blur, the idea of Tartaria grew, calmly, steadily, almost naturally, shaped by both history and the quiet spaces history leaves behind. As the world moved slowly into the early modern era, the shape of knowledge began to shift. European explorers traveled farther than before, merchants ventured into distant markets, and scholars collected fragments of information from every corner of the known world. Yet even with these growing networks, much of Asia, especially the northern expanses, remained only partially understood. And so, the age of early modern mapmaking became a quiet dance between imagination and observation, a time when vast regions were charted with confidence even though their details were still soft and incomplete. In this era, the word Tartary settled more firmly into maps, stretched gently across territories that few Europeans had ever seen with their own eyes. Picture a small print shop in the 1600s, the scent of ink hanging in the air. Large sheets of paper lie drying on wooden racks, their fresh lines still dark and crisp. Cartographers study reports brought back by traders who crossed mountains and deserts. They examine letters from diplomats stationed at the edges of foreign empires. They consult older maps, filled with decorative illustrations rather than precise borders, and compare them to new stories that slowly trickle in. Each mapmaker must decide where the known world ends and where interpretation begins. And in that uncertain space, Tartary becomes a convenient answer, vast, simple, calming in its broadness. Early modern maps were often works of art as much as they were instruments of navigation. Bordering oceans were shaded lovingly, mountains were drawn with meticulous strokes, and rivers curved gracefully across the page. But as one moved further east, the details began to thin. City names became sparse. Sketches replaced certainty. And eventually, the quill would drift into a wide area labeled with a single sweeping term: Tartaria. This era valued order and categorization, and yet the northern world resisted both. The people living there followed seasonal migrations, their lands shifting constantly with climate, alliances, and lifestyle. For European scholars accustomed to settled kingdoms and defined borders, it was difficult to map a culture whose boundaries were not fixed. That difficulty translated into broad strokes on parchment, where one name could stand in place of many. It was not done out of disrespect, it was simply the nature of the time. Mapmakers needed labels. Readers needed shapes. And the unknown needed to be contained, even softly, even imperfectly. So Tartary stretched across regions that encompass Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, and parts of Central Asia, territories too vast and varied to summarize, yet placed under one gentle umbrella in European eyes. As printing technology improved, maps became more widely distributed, and the idea of Tartaria became more familiar. A scholar in France, a merchant in Venice, and a student in London could all open an atlas and see the same word printed across the top of Asia. This consistency created a sense of authority. Whether or not the label reflected reality mattered less than the comfort of seeing the same name repeated. Over time, the repetition settled into culture, forming a quiet expectation that the northern world was unified under one identity. Travelers returning from Siberia or Central Asia wrote letters describing the vastness, the cold, the shifting tribes, and the sprawling forests. But their writings rarely captured the full complexity of the region. Experiences varied depending on the season, the route taken, or the people they encountered. Some returned with stories of kindness and hospitality. Others described harsh journeys and difficult conditions. When these accounts reached Europe, they were gathered, filtered, and merged into a single narrative. And once again, the name Tartary served as the boundary that held all these impressions together. The aesthetic choices of early modern mapmakers also influenced how Tartaria was imagined. Many maps included decorative elements, drawings of animals, mountains, or mythical creatures, that filled empty spaces where information was lacking. These embellishments made the region seem even more mysterious. A small sketch of a camel might appear where a desert was assumed to exist. A cluster of tents might symbolize nomadic groups. These illustrations were not always accurate, but they offered a sense of life and character to places that were, to European eyes, distant and unknown. With each new edition, maps became slightly more detailed, yet still incomplete. Explorations by Russian expeditions into Siberia brought new outlines of coastlines and rivers, but the deeper interior remained elusive. Meanwhile, European readers became increasingly comfortable with the idea that one grand region called Tartary stretched across the map like a calm, undivided wilderness. Even as knowledge improved, the word lingered. It had been used for so long that it became habit, part of the mental geography of the age. And this habit contributed to the gradual blending of different cultures under one name. Mongols, Siberian tribes, Turkic peoples, and Manchu dynasties all lived in lands that were, to European mapmakers, simply portions of the same great northern expanse. The label served as a soft blanket, gently covering the diversity beneath it. There is something tranquil about the way these maps attempted to make the world feel whole. Even in their inaccuracies, they provided people with a sense of coherence. A person who might never travel beyond their hometown could open a book and feel as though they understood the shape of the earth. Tartary, whether real or imagined, contributed to that comfort. This early modern period marked a transition between medieval imagination and modern precision. Gradually, as scientific exploration increased and more accurate surveys took place, the name Tartary would begin to fade. But during the centuries when mapmaking still balanced on the border between art and speculation, the label thrived. It floated across atlases like a quiet remnant of a time when unknown lands were not feared, but simply accepted as part of the world's natural mystery. And as you let your thoughts settle into this part of history, you may find peace in the slow way knowledge expands. The world did not rush to define every border. Instead, it allowed wide spaces to exist on the map, spaces filled not with rigid facts but with gentle impressions. Tartary was one of those impressions, a region shaped as much by imagination as by observation, and a reminder of how the unknown can be both calming and endlessly intriguing. When we look back at the soft, drifting idea of Tartaria, one of the most gently tangled threads in its formation is the evolution of the words used to describe its people. Language has always shaped how societies perceive the world, sometimes with precision and sometimes with the haze of misunderstanding. In the case of Tartaria, much of the confusion arose from the way European languages struggled to interpret foreign sounds, accents, and names. Over time, these linguistic shifts created a subtle blending of identities, Tatars, Tartars, and eventually Tartaria, all woven together with strokes of ink, quiet assumptions, and the natural imperfections of translation. To understand how this happened, imagine a medieval merchant returning from a long journey through the eastern lands. He speaks a Turkic or Mongolic word he heard along the way, perhaps Tatar, referring to a group of steppe people whose name was rooted in their own traditions. But as he shares his story with others, the pronunciation changes slightly, softened or hardened by the listener's native tongue. Scribal errors, accents, and unfamiliar alphabets all play their part. The word Tatar, which has no connection to myth or legend, begins to sound like Tartar, a term that European languages found easier to pronounce and write. In medieval Europe, the shift from Tatar to Tartar carried an unintended echo. The newly formed word resembled Tartarus, the ancient Greek term for a deep, shadowy underworld. Though no connection existed between the steppe people and that mythological realm, the similarity in sound subtly influenced perception. For some writers, especially those unfamiliar with the cultures they described, the association lent an air of mystery or danger, deepening the sense of distance between themselves and the people they were trying to name. These small linguistic moments, repeated hundreds of times across manuscripts and maps, gradually shaped how an entire region was conceptualized. But language is fluid by nature. It bends with memory, adapts to context, and shifts with each retelling. As monks copied manuscripts by hand, as diplomats translated letters, as traders passed down stories in dim, candlelit taverns, the words continued to drift. The term Tartar became common in European accounts not because it reflected reality, but because it was easy, familiar, and convenient. The people it described, Turkic groups, Mongols, and various steppe tribes, never called themselves by this name. They identified with their clans, their families, their local traditions. Yet the European label persisted, gently flattening the diversity of these cultures into a single, simplified identity. This was not a deliberate distortion. It was simply how communication worked in a time before dictionaries and standardized spelling. A single word might be written in several ways within the same document. Travelers from different regions might pronounce the same name with entirely different shapes. When these words reached mapmakers and scholars, they made small choices based on what sounded most plausible or most consistent with past works. And so the name, Tartar, became widely accepted, eventually giving rise to the broader geographical term, Tartary, a word that extended the linguistic misunderstanding into a vast region. If you imagine an early cartographer examining a map of Asia, you can envision the quiet thought process that led to this choice. He sees the word, Tartar, in a traveler's report, written with shaky script and uneven ink. He compares it to another document that spells the word, Tatar. Not knowing which is correct, and with no easy way to verify, he selects the version that appears most often. His quill dips into the ink, and he writes the word across great stretches of land. With that simple gesture, the linguistic drift becomes part of the official record. Over generations, the distinction between Tatar and Tartar faded in European understanding. Scholars debated it occasionally, but the widespread usage of the altered form kept it alive. This confusion quietly shaped how the region was perceived, merging peoples and places into one unified label. The reality, however, was far more delicate. Tatars were a specific group with a specific identity. The term Tartars, as Europeans used it, encompassed a wide variety of unrelated cultures simply because their languages and lifestyles seemed superficially similar. The geography they occupied was not a single realm, but a mosaic of communities stretching across enormous distances. Language also influenced how myths formed. Because the term Tartar seemed to resemble a word associated with mythological depths, some writers embellished their descriptions with dramatic tones. They portrayed the northern lands as mysterious and harsh, inhabited by people of incredible endurance and strength. These descriptions were not malicious, they were literary, shaped by the storytelling traditions of the time. But each story, each retelling, and each map bearing the word Tartary contributed quietly to the image of a grand, enigmatic empire that may never have existed as Europeans imagined it. There is a gentle lesson hidden in this linguistic evolution, that much of what we believe about distant places comes from the words used to describe them. When the words shift, the meaning shifts with them. In the case of Tartaria, the misunderstanding was soft, subtle, and gradual, a reminder that history is often shaped by small details that accumulate over centuries. As language flowed across borders, the people who lived in these regions continued their lives unaffected by the labels imposed from afar. They herded their animals across the plains, followed traditional seasonal routes, and passed down their own names and histories with clarity. The confusion existed only in the minds of those trying to interpret their world from a distance. Looking back, this blending of words feels almost soothing, like watching streams merge into a river. The distinctions soften, the sound changes, and a new identity forms, not out of intention, but out of the natural fluidity of human communication. And in that fluidity, the myth of Tartaria gained one of its most enduring pieces, a name shaped by language rather than by the people it described. As the centuries drifted onward and the world slowly transitioned from medieval imagination into early modern observation, few powers influenced the northern lands as profoundly as the Russian Empire. Its eastward expansion, stretching across forests, rivers, and frozen plains, gradually absorbed enormous territories that Europeans had long labeled with the broad, misty term Tartary. Unlike the travelers who came before, Russia did not engage with these lands from a distance. It walked into them step by step, settlement by settlement, its presence growing steadily like the slow, spreading glow of dawn across a quiet horizon. And in this quiet movement, the identity of Tartaria began to shift, gently dissolving into the administrative structures of an empire that preferred precision over ambiguity. To imagine this transformation, picture a small Russian outpost in the early days of expansion. Wooden palisades rise from the snowy ground, their beams darkened by winter frost. Inside, traders, soldiers, and families gather around fires, warming their hands as they speak softly of the unfamiliar lands they have entered. Beyond the wooden walls lies a world that stretches endlessly, thick forests where trees stand silent and unmoving, wide rivers whose surfaces freeze into smooth mirrors in the cold months, and open plains where the wind carries no trace of human settlement. These early frontier communities were not grand cities. They were simple, temporary footholds, yet they marked the beginning of a profound geographic shift. As Russia continued to expand eastward, it formed relationships, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tense, with the many communities already living in the region. These included tribes of Siberian hunters, groups of Turkic and Mongolic descent, families who lived close to the land in ways that had remained unchanged for centuries. They preserved their traditions quietly, observing the newcomers with caution and curiosity. And although these groups were diverse in their customs, languages, and beliefs, Russian administrators began to document them in a more detailed way than European travelers ever had. They recorded the names of villages, mapped the winding paths of rivers, and catalogued the natural resources of the land with growing accuracy. These administrative efforts slowly replaced the broad, poetic vision of Tartaria with something more concrete. Instead of a single name stretched across the top of Asia, Russia began assigning specific labels to regions that had previously seemed unified. Siberia became a term of governance. Yakutia, Buryatia, and other names emerged, tied to ethnic groups, local histories, and geographic boundaries. Out of necessity, Russian officials developed a clearer view of lands that Europeans still treated as part of a sweeping, mysterious expanse. The empire's bureaucracy softened the myth of Tartaria not through force, but through the quiet accumulation of detail. Still, European mapmakers continued to use the term Tartary long after Russia had begun the process of division and reclassification. Their atlases showed Great Tartary, overlapping with what Russia now called Siberia. They labeled smaller areas Little Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Independent Tartary, reflecting broad impressions rather than the nuanced identities that Russian documents were starting to reveal. From their distant perspective, the old name provided simplicity, a comforting continuity, even as the reality on the ground became more complex. In many ways, Russia's expansion into these lands mirrored the rhythm of nature itself. The movement was slow, season-dependent, and deeply influenced by the environment. Winter months froze rivers into pathways, allowing sleds to glide across distances that would have been impassable in warmer seasons. Summer brought softer earth, swelling water, and remote communities coming alive with trade and travel. As the empire's explorers, surveyors, and settlers moved deeper into the region, they learned to adapt to this rhythm, becoming part of the landscape in subtle ways. The people who lived in these territories, though diverse, shared similar relationships with the land. They hunted along frozen lakes, fished in rivers where the water ran clear and cold, and built homes designed to withstand long winters. Their spiritual beliefs often centered around nature, paying respect to the forests, animals, and seasonal cycles that shaped their existence. These traditions persisted even as Russian influence grew, creating a delicate blend of cultures, distinct, yet connected through geography and daily life. Administratively, Russia introduced systems that had not existed in the region before. Census records were kept. Taxes were collected. New settlements appeared along trade routes, forming chain-like patterns across the map. With each new entry in a ledger and each new mark on a chart, the concept of Tartaria shrank a little more. It did not vanish abruptly. It faded softly, replaced by names that reflected political boundaries rather than imaginative geography. This transition was not without tension. Some communities resisted the empire's authority, others adapted or collaborated. Yet the change itself, viewed from a distance, unfolded in a steady, measured way. There were no sudden collapses or dramatic erasures, just the slow, careful process of integrating vast lands into a growing imperial structure. And as this process unfolded, European observers found themselves increasingly removed from the everyday realities of the region. Their maps continued to show Tartary because they lacked the direct knowledge Russia was gathering. The contrast became clear over time. Where Russian maps featured specific names, European maps retained shadowy outlines. Where Russian documents listed tribes individually, European texts grouped them into broad categories. This gentle discrepancy between local reality and foreign perception contributed to the lingering allure of Tartaria as a semi-mythic region. It became, in a sense, a ghost of earlier centuries, a label maintained through habit, curiosity, and the comfort of the familiar. What made this transformation so subtle was the quietness of it. Empires often grow through loud, disruptive events, but Russia's movement across the northern world was defined largely by endurance and persistence. Step by step, the land was charted. Day by day, settlements formed. Year by year, old names shifted into new ones. And throughout this process, the ancient idea of a single, unified northern world, Tartaria, continued to fade gently into memory. If you imagine a Russian mapmaker in the 1700s, sitting at his desk beside a frosted window, you can sense the calm certainty that accompanied this shift. His quill moves patiently as he outlines the banks of the Yenisei River. He marks villages by name. He divides vast territories into administrative units. In doing so, he is not thinking about myths or legends. He is thinking about clarity, order, and accuracy. His map reflects the world as he knows it, shaped by direct contact. Meanwhile, far away in Western Europe, someone opens an atlas and sees a different version of the same land, less detailed, more mysterious, still bearing the name Tartary.
As the story of the northern world continues to unfold, another great power comes quietly into view, one whose influence shaped the lands east of the Mongolian steppes, deep into Manchuria, and up toward the distant frontiers that touched Siberia. This was the Qing dynasty of China, a ruling family whose reach extended across mountains, deserts, fertile valleys, and wind-swept plains. To understand how the idea of Tartaria evolved in the minds of Europeans, it is essential to drift gently into the perspective of the Qing. Their records, their maps, and their worldview formed a significant counterpoint to the vague, sweeping labels seen on Western charts. Through their eyes, the lands Europeans once called Tartary were not a single, unified realm, but a rich tapestry of peoples and regions, each with its own rhythms and identities. Imagine a Qing cartographer carefully unrolling a large sheet of silk upon a wooden table. The silk glimmers softly in the lamplight, smooth beneath his steady hands. His tools are simple: brush, inkstone, water. But his knowledge is precise, gathered from imperial officials, border inspections, envoys, and centuries of inherited documentation. As he lifts the brush, he begins to paint the familiar contours of mountains, rivers, and border walls with a calm, practiced motion. His map is not vague or imagined. It is an expression of the empire's understanding of its lands, shaped by direct contact and administration. In the Qing worldview, regions such as Mongolia, Manchuria, and Xinjiang were not mysteries. They were integral parts of a multi-ethnic empire, tied together through political negotiations, alliances, and centuries-old relationships. The peoples who lived in these territories, Mongols, Manchus, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Tibetans, and many others, were recognized not as a single group, but as distinct cultures with their own traditions and histories. Chinese imperial records were meticulous in documenting these differences. They listed tribes by name, identified leaders, tracked taxes, and described the landscapes with clarity. None of this resembled the sweeping label used by Europeans. But Europe was far away, and its map-makers worked with limited information. While Qing scholars maintained detailed archives, Europeans often relied on second-hand accounts filtered through traders or missionaries. These intermediaries, limited by language barriers and the difficulties of long-distance travel, passed along only fragments of Qing knowledge. Many of these fragments reached Europe disconnected from their original context. A report describing Manchuria might be conflated with one describing Mongolia. A document about a specific khanate might be assumed to describe an entire region. Over time, the precise knowledge held by the Qing gradually blurred into the broad concept Europeans already felt comfortable using. To the Qing dynasty, the northern regions were not a blank space. They were part of a living administrative system. Mongolia was divided into leagues and banners, each governed by local noble families who worked in cooperation with the imperial court. Manchuria, the homeland of the Qing rulers themselves, was central to their identity. Xinjiang, though distant, was tied to the empire through military garrisons and trade networks. Each area had boundaries rooted in real geography, mountain ranges that framed the land, rivers that guided travel, and deserts that marked natural limits. None of these boundaries matched the sweeping, open-ended region that Western maps labeled so loosely. Yet despite this clarity, much of the Qing understanding remained unknown to Europeans. Policies controlling the movement of foreigners limited direct access to many regions, especially those considered sensitive. Few European travelers were permitted to venture deep into Manchuria or Inner Mongolia. Even fewer could communicate directly with local people or read Chinese records. As a result, the descriptions carried back to Europe, although sometimes rich in detail, could never fully replace the general assumptions that Western scholars had inherited from earlier centuries. In this soft contrast, Qing specificity versus European vagueness, the myth of Tartaria continued to live quietly. Western cartographers saw that China was a major empire, well documented and clearly delineated, but everything north of the Great Wall still appeared enormous, undivided, and mysterious. The Great Wall itself, stretching like a patient stone ribbon across the landscape, became a psychological boundary in European minds. South of it, China, ordered and known. North of it, a vast world of nomads, mountains, and imagined kingdoms. The Qing never viewed the world this way, but Western mapmakers, lacking local insight, found comfort in this simple division. If we drift deeper into the Qing perspective, we discover not mystery, but movement and diversity. Mongolian herders traveled with their animals, following seasonal cycles. Tibetan caravans carried salt and wool across high mountain passes. Manchu hunters managed forests and rivers with a deep respect for ancestral traditions. These varied lifestyles were recorded by Qing officials in neat columns of characters, describing everything from harvest yields to tribal leadership structures. Yet, when these records eventually made their way to the West, they often arrived stripped of context, leaving only hints of the complexity behind them. There is a quiet irony in the way the Qing and European views overlapped. Both acknowledged the northern lands as significant, but one saw them clearly while the other saw them through a veil of distance. For the Qing, these regions were familiar, connected, and usually well understood. For Europeans, they were part of the enduring image of a single, vast northern realm whose boundaries were more poetic than political. And in that gap between perspectives, the concept of Tartaria lingered, a peaceful shadow of earlier centuries, gently preserved by maps that had yet to be updated with precision the Qing already possessed. As the world gradually grew more interconnected, these differences in perspective became more apparent. But during the long centuries when the Qing maintained their steady governance across northern Asia, European minds remained far enough away that the old name continued to float across atlases. It was not a statement of fact. It was a placeholder filled with imaginative air, a label that soothed the unfamiliar with a single, unifying word. And in the soft quiet of this contrast between detailed reality and distant interpretation, the story of Tartaria continued to evolve, shaped not only by history, but also by the gentle drift of language, geography, and time itself. To understand the lands once folded beneath the soft, imagined shape of Tartaria, it helps to step away from the maps, away from political lines, and drift quietly into the daily life of the people who lived across the vast expanse of the steppe. Long before borders were drawn and names were assigned, communities here lived with a gentle rhythm shaped entirely by nature. Their routines followed the seasons. Their traditions flowed from generation to generation like a slow, steady river, and their relationship with the land was so deep that it became as familiar as breath itself. Imagine waking in a felt-covered dwelling as dawn unfolds across the plains. A pale blue light seeps through the opening of the tent, and the air is crisp and fresh. Horses shift softly outside, their movements creating a gentle hum that blends with the distant sound of the wind. Inside, a small fire smolders near the center, sending slow curls of smoke upward, warming the space just enough to take the edge off the morning chill. A pot of milk tea simmers quietly, its aroma comforting and familiar. This is a moment shared by countless families who lived across the steppe. Mongols, Turkic peoples, nomadic tribes who found home not in fixed walls, but in the wide expanse around them. Daily life was built around movement, but not aimless movement. It was guided by knowledge handed down through centuries, knowledge of which pastures would be lush after rain, where rivers froze safely in winter, and which valleys offered warmth against harsh winds. Families traveled together with their herds, their belongings packed neatly onto wagons or strapped onto strong, patient animals. Their homes, yurts, or jers were designed to be dismantled and rebuilt in a matter of hours, yet they remained warm, sturdy, and welcoming in every season. These dwellings were small worlds of their own. Felt walls softened sound, creating a peaceful interior where conversations were gentle and intimate. Sunlight filtered through openings in the roof, illuminating rugs with intricate patterns. Children played near the fire, learning early how to handle tools, tend animals, and navigate the open land. Life was woven with simple tasks that required skill and patience. Milking Mars at dawn, herding sheep across grassy slopes, repairing harnesses, preparing meals made from dairy, meat, and whatever the land provided. Each task was familiar, predictable, and grounding. For many groups across the steppe, horses were not merely animals. They were companions, partners, and essential parts of daily existence. People learned to ride at an astonishingly young age, developing balance and confidence long before adulthood. Riding was not an event. It was a way of moving through the world. Herds grazed freely in the open, watched over by children, elders, or anyone who had a moment to spare. The steady sound of hooves echoed across the plains, blending with the wind in a rhythm that felt timeless. Spirituality intertwined gently with daily life. Many communities believed the land itself had a spirit, that mountains held power, rivers carried memories, and animals deserved respect. Sky, earth, and ancestors formed a connected whole. Ceremonies, though simple, carried deep meaning. Offerings of milk to the sky, songs sung during gatherings, small rituals to honor ancestors before long journeys. None of these practices were grand or elaborate. They were quiet expressions of gratitude and harmony between people and their surroundings. Evenings on the steppe carried their own tranquility. As the sun descended, fires flickered inside yurts, casting warm light across woven blankets and wooden bowls. Families gathered to share stories, often narrated in soft voices that rose and fell like the steady flow of wind outside. The stories told of ancient heroes, mythical creatures, wise elders, and journeys through landscapes both real and imagined. These tales preserved history, taught lessons, and soothed restless minds at the end of long days. Outside, stars appeared in overwhelming numbers, their brightness untouched by city lights. The sky stretched endlessly above, a silent companion through the night. Although outsiders often imagined these people as a single group, the reality was more nuanced. Each tribe had its own customs, dialects, foods, and clothing styles. Some communities relied heavily on horses, while others herded camels or reindeer. Some built temporary wooden structures near rivers during certain seasons, while others moved endlessly across grasslands. Their clothing reflected both practicality and cultural identity. Long robes belted at the waist, thick boots for cold weather, hats adorned with fur or simple embroidery. Despite their differences, they share an understanding of the land, a respect for its power, recognition of its limits, and gratitude for what it provided. Trade played a surprisingly important role in their lives. Caravans passed through the steppe carrying silk, grain, metal, and handcrafted goods. Markets appeared in seasonal camps or along major routes where people exchanged items, stories, and news. These interactions connected distant communities in quiet yet significant ways. Even without permanent cities, networks formed through marriage, trade, and shared history. The beauty of this life did not come from luxury or abundance, but from simplicity and connection. Everything served a purpose. Tools were crafted with care. Clothing was made to withstand harsh winters. Food was preserved for leaner months. People depended on one another with trust built from shared experiences. In such an environment, cooperation was essential, and conflict, though present at times, was rarely allowed to disrupt the fragile balance between people and nature. When early travelers encountered these communities, They often failed to grasp the depth of their traditions. They saw mobility and assumed instability. They saw tents and assumed impermanence. They saw unfamiliar customs and interpreted them as exotic or strange. But beneath those first impressions was a world both rich and deeply structured, shaped by centuries of adaptation to the land. Looking back, it is easy to see how these daily rhythms, peaceful and grounded, contribute to the creation of the idea outsiders labeled Tartaria. The vastness of the landscape and the fluidity of nomadic life made it difficult for European observers to define or categorize these people precisely. So they grouped them together under a single name, unaware of the quiet complexity unfolding across the plains. Yet the reality, this gentle, slow-moving tapestry of life on the steppe, was far more intricate than any label could capture. And as we drift deeper into this story, the calm rhythm of their days continues to echo softly, reminding us that history is often lived not in grand empires or dramatic events, but in small, everyday moments shaped by the land, the seasons, and the enduring bond between people and the world around them. As the centuries passed and the world entered an age of rediscovery, curiosity, and speculation, the quiet lands once labeled as Tartaria began to gather new layers of mythology. These myths did not form suddenly. Rather, they emerged slowly, shaped by forgotten ruins, misunderstood architecture, and the natural human desire to imagine civilizations grander, older, and more mysterious than the ones history recorded. In these wide spaces, where early maps showed uncertainty, where travelers described endless plains, and where older cultures left behind only faint traces, modern minds began to see possibilities. They saw not just nomads and kingdoms, but lost cities, hidden technologies, and the remains of civilization that might have been far more advanced than the world ever realized. Imagine wandering through an old city today, perhaps somewhere in Russia, Central Asia, or Eastern Europe. You see a building with towering columns, ornate facades, and intricate stonework. Its scale feels surprising, almost out of place with the small town that surrounds it. Time has worn its walls, but its structure still stands strong, solid, and elegant. For many people encountering such buildings with no architectural context, these structures seem older than the official dates suggest. Their appearance invites questions. Who built this? How was it constructed? And why does it look so different from everything around it? It is in these quiet moments of wonder that myths begin. Some believe these grand structures are remnants of a forgotten empire, one so advanced that modern society has misunderstood or erased it. Others point to ways cities burned, flooded, shifted, or were rebuilt over centuries, leaving layers of history beneath the ground. When someone sees a basement window that appears to sit half buried in soil, they may wonder whether the building once stood on a different level of earth. When someone sees doorways today that are far taller than the average person, their imagination may drift toward giants or architectural standards lost to time. And in the slow accumulation of curious details, real, perceived, or misunderstood, a new version of Tartaria begins to take shape. Not the Tartaria of medieval maps, nor the Tartaria of nomadic tribes, but mythic Tartaria filled with towering cities, intricate machinery, and monumental architecture spread across the world like gentle reminders of a forgotten age. These modern myths often revolve around the idea of a great, unified civilization that existed long before our recorded history. Some describe domed buildings that seem too advanced for their time. Others point to decorative patterns and engineering techniques that appear unexpectedly uniform across distant regions. To a curious mind, these similarities hint at connection, at communication, at a shared knowledge lost somewhere in the folds of time. And because the historical Tartaria was once drawn across such a vast area, it becomes an inviting canvas upon which the imagination can paint a story of grandeur. Many who explore these myths speak of structures built with precision that seems to defy the craftsmanship of centuries past. They mention cathedrals, government buildings, and palaces with enormous doors and enormous halls. Spaces so large and ornate that they feel almost theatrical in their beauty. It is not surprising that people see these old buildings and imagine a civilization capable of wonders. When walking through a quiet city square in winter, snow falling gently around a centuries-old structure, it is easy to feel as though the building carries stories that nobody has told. The silence itself seems to whisper possibilities. But not all the myths come from architecture. Some arise from maps. Old, weathered maps drawn with confidence but little accuracy. A person might look at a centuries-old atlas that displays Tartary as a great northern empire and wonder why such a massive place disappeared from history. The idea of a lost civilization becomes comforting in its own way, providing a narrative that fills the blank spaces with meaning. In this sense, the myth of Tartaria is gentle, not confrontational. It allows room for mystery in a world that often feels fully explained. People also point to scattered artifacts, odd pieces of machinery, tools with unknown purposes, or objects that resemble parts of larger constructions. These discoveries, though often explained by historians, can still stir the imagination. When you hold something old and unfamiliar in your hands, the weight of time becomes almost tangible. You begin to wonder what hands held it before yours, what world it belonged to, and what knowledge those earlier people carried with them. There is something soothing about believing that the past was filled with wonders we no longer understand. Mystery, after all, has a calming effect when it is approached without fear. It allows the mind to drift, to fill the gaps with gentle speculation, to imagine ancient cities glowing softly at dusk, their towers rising into the sky, their people moving through streets paved with knowledge we can only guess at. The myth of Tartaria also grows in the fertile soil of forgotten histories. Many regions once labeled by Europeans as Tartary did have rich, complex cultures, empires, khanates, and kingdoms now overshadowed by the narratives of larger nations. Their stories faded, not because they were unimportant, but because history often records only the powerful voices, leaving quieter civilizations to drift into obscurity. When modern people search for these missing stories, they sometimes weave myth and fact together, creating a tapestry where imagination fills the spaces left empty by time. In truth, much of what fuels the modern vision of Tartaria are these empty spaces, varied buildings whose origins seem unclear, maps that no longer match our understanding of geography, and a human desire to believe that the world once held secrets deeper than we know. These myths do not replace history. They accompany it, running softly alongside, offering alternative possibilities that soothe the curiosity of the mind, especially in quiet moments. And as you follow this thread of myth, it becomes easy to see why Tartaria continues to live in imagination. It is not simply a place that was forgotten. It is a place that invites wonder, a place that feels like a doorway to a world that might have been, a world where architecture touched the skies, where technology surpassed the ordinary, and where human history followed a path now lost beneath layers of time. When people wander through old cities, study faded photographs, or scroll across images of half-buried buildings, their imaginations often awaken with a gentle curiosity. They notice unusual details, windows partly covered by soil, doors that seem lower than the current ground level, rooms that appear sunken far beneath modern sidewalks. These observations, combined with stories passed quietly across the internet, have given rise to a modern narrative known as the mud flood. It is not a single event in history, but a collection of ideas shaped by scattered clues, misunderstood architecture, and the soothing sense of mystery that emerges when the past feels incomplete. This narrative has woven itself softly into the larger mythology of Tartaria, creating a calm space where imagination and history blend like mist over distant plains. The idea of the mud flood often begins with something simple, a building whose foundation seems deeper than expected. Perhaps a basement window sits at ground level, or a door appears to open onto soil rather than a street. Without context, such details invite questions. Did something bury the building? Was the land once lower? And if so, what caused it to rise? The explanations are rarely straightforward, and in that uncertainty, stories begin to grow. People imagine a vast event, quiet, sudden, and consuming, that covered cities in a blanket of earth or mud, forcing later generations to dig their way up from the remains. It is easy to understand the gentle appeal of such an idea. There is something soothing about imagining a forgotten moment in time, an event that reshaped the land in ways that no one fully recorded. It creates room for wonder, for speculation, for imagining hidden chapters in humanity's story. And because Tartaria already lives in the modern imagination as a place of mystery, the mud flood becomes a natural addition, a possible explanation for why the traces of the supposed civilization seem obscured or buried. When people walk through old districts in cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow, Istanbul, or even certain parts of Europe and North America, they sometimes notice that older buildings sit at unusual depths. Streets appear to have risen over centuries, layers of paving built upon older layers, leaving the original entrances far below today's sidewalks. These changes often happen gradually, through reconstruction and rebuilding, through fires and floods, through shifting urban design. But when one encounters only the finished picture, without the history of what came before, it is easy to imagine a different story. A story where a single event rearranged everything in a quiet, dramatic transformation. Some who explore the mudflood idea imagine a sweeping layer of earth covering continents, leaving only rooftops and upper floors visible. Others see it as a series of localized events, landslides, floods, volcanic ash, or the natural rise of city streets, combined into a single narrative. And still others view it through a symbolic lens, imagining it not as a literal flood of mud, but as a metaphor for forgotten knowledge, buried memories, or civilizations that slipped quietly beneath the surface of recorded history. These interpretations, though varied, share a gentle quality. They reflect the longing and understand what lies beneath the visible world, the desire to uncover hidden layers that time has concealed. The mud flood story, especially when connected to Tartaria, provides a frame for that longing. It suggests that the world we see today is built upon something older, larger, and perhaps more wondrous than we realize. Even if the details remain unclear, the feeling behind the myth brings a kind of comfort, the sense that history is richer and deeper than modern accounts suggest. Consider the ruins that scatter the earth, some partly buried, some consumed by soil and vegetation. Ancient cities swallowed by deserts, temples hidden beneath centuries of dust, houses forgotten under layers of volcanic ash. Nature has always reshaped human spaces in ways that soften edges and erase details. Over time, landscapes rise and fall, soil drifts, rivers change course, and mountains shift. The mudflood idea is, in some ways, a whisper of this natural process, an attempt to gather countless small transformations into one poetic, unifying image. Some people interpret photographic evidence, seeing horse-drawn carriages passing half-buried storefronts in old images. Others notice large buildings in remote places that seem accidentally preserved, untouched by modern expansion, their lower floors resting below the present surface of the earth. Such details, when observed without context, create a feeling of quiet intrigue. They become small windows into a world that feels partially hidden, like a story whose early chapters have been lost. There's also a psychological layer to these myths. Humans naturally seek patterns, especially in moments of mystery. When faced with an unusual sight, soil covering stone, stairs leading downward into ground, tall doors far above street level, the mind instinctively asks for a narrative. And when official explanations appear fragmented or incomplete, the imagination fills the space with possibilities. The mudflood myth grows gently in this space, offering simple answers to complicated histories. It paints a picture that feels cohesive, calm, and strangely satisfying, even if it is not rooted in a single historical event. For many, the mudflood is not about proving something, but about exploring a feeling, an intuitive sense that the past contains wonders more profound than the textbooks reveal. It becomes a quiet invitation to look more closely, to question softly, to wonder without urgency. In this way, the myth becomes a tool for contemplation rather than confrontation. It soothes the imagination with the possibility that something extraordinary once occurred, leaving behind subtle traces in the architecture and landscape we still walk through today. And when combined with the idea of Tartaria, the mudflood becomes part of a broader narrative, a soft suggestion that an entire civilization might have been partially hidden or altered by time, whether viewed literally or metaphorically. The image of the mudflood evokes the same gentle curiosity that drew earlier generations to the blank spaces on old maps. It encourages a dreamy form of exploration, one that floats between history and myth, guided not by strict records, but by the quiet yearning to uncover what was forgotten. Across many cities of the world, there stand buildings whose shapes feel larger than life, whose details catch the eye with quiet insistence, and whose presence evokes a gentle sense of awe. These structures, cathedrals, palaces, theaters, old government halls, and monumental public buildings, form the architectural background to the myths that surround Tartaria. When people look upon towering columns, intricate facades, or domes rising like serene planets above city squares, many feel a soft spark of curiosity. How were these built, and by whom? Why do they seem older than their official construction dates? And why do buildings from vastly different regions sometimes appear to share similar stylistic elements? Such questions often drift into modern myths, but the reality beneath them is equally intriguing. The architectural styles that inspire these feelings did not belong to a single forgotten civilization. They emerged from periods of artistic ambition, from cross-cultural inspiration, from empires seeking grandeur, and from artisans whose skills passed patiently from one generation to another. When examined gently, without urgency, these buildings tell a story of human creativity unfolding slowly across centuries, one that is both peaceful and profound. Imagine walking through a quiet city square just after sunrise. The air is crisp, the light soft and golden, and facade of grand buildings stand before you in serene stillness. Tall columns frame its entrance like silent guardians. Ornate carvings run along the edges, their details softened by time. Above, a dome catches the early light and seems to glow faintly, as though warmed by the sun from within. Scenes like this exist in many places: St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, Istanbul, Bucharest, Mumbai, San Francisco, and countless others. The architecture feels universal, as if shaped by a shared language of beauty. This shared language is partly why people connect such structures to the mythic Tartaria. They seem too widespread, too grand, too similar in their elegance to belong to isolated national histories. But the truth is a gentle one. These buildings were inspired by styles that crossed borders long before the modern era. The Baroque, Neoclassical, Byzantine, Ottoman, and Renaissance influences travel from one region to another along trade routes, through diplomatic exchanges, and within the artistic circles of empires. Each region then adapted these styles in its own way, creating buildings that feel familiar yet unique, like variations of the same soft melody. In Europe, the Baroque style flourished during a time when monarchs and religious institutions sought to express power and spirituality through architecture. Its sweeping curves, dramatic columns, and grand domes were meant to inspire awe. When seen today, these features can feel strangely advanced for their time, leading some to imagine a lost civilization of master builders. But these elements were crafted slowly by artisans who trained for years, learning techniques passed down through guilds and workshops. Neoclassical architecture, with its clean lines and elegant symmetry, added another layer to this shared visual language. Inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, it spread through Europe and eventually into Russia, America, and parts of Asia. The appeal of neoclassicism lay in its calm balance. Buildings designed in this style often feel timeless, as though they exist outside the boundaries of history. This timelessness feeds into the sense that such structures could belong to an ancient or forgotten empire, even though they often date to the 18th or 19th centuries. In the Ottoman world, domes and arches formed the heart of architectural expression. Their rounded silhouettes and repeating patterns gave structures a serene, almost meditative quality. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, Persian and Timurid influences produced turquoise domes, geometric tilework, and grand entrances decorated with layers of color. These artistic traditions radiated outward, inspiring architects across continents. When modern eyes encounter these similarities without context, it is easy to imagine a single civilization tying them all together. But in truth, these are cultural echoes, shared inspirations, not shared origins. Russia, too, played a significant role in shaping the architecture associated with Tartarian myths. Cities like St. Petersburg were designed with intentional grandeur, drawing heavily from Western European styles blended with local traditions. Palaces and administrative buildings were built with thick walls, stone foundations, and elaborate details that have survived the test of time. Their strength and beauty can make them appear older than they truly are, especially when sunlight catches the worn edges of a column or when snow collects softly on the ornate frames of windows. Another reason these buildings feel connected to myth is their scale. Many feature enormous doorways, towering ceilings, and sprawling halls that dwarf the human form. When people see doorways far taller than necessary or windows stretching high above the ground, they sometimes imagine giants or advanced civilizations. But these grand proportions were artistic choices. They were designed to impress, to symbolize prestige, to create a sense of importance for the institutions housed within. They were built not for giants, but for symbolism. In cities that experience fires, wars, or periods of rapid rebuilding, older structures often sit lower than the current ground level. Layers of soil, brick, and pavement accumulate over centuries, raising the streets while buildings remain anchored to their original foundations. This natural rising of land has created the appearance of buried architecture, leading some to believe that entire lower floors were once above ground. But urban development is a quiet, gradual process. Roads are raised to prevent flooding. New layers are added with each reconstruction, and old cities evolve like living organisms. The result is a landscape where architecture tells multiple stories layered gently atop one another. When people connect these buried structures with the idea of a lost Tartarian civilization, it comes from a place of curiosity and wonder, not from malice or error. There is something soothing about imagining that the world once held secrets deeper than recorded history suggests, grand, unified empires whose beauty still lingers in scattered monuments. These myths offer a dreamlike sense of continuity, as though humanity is part of a longer story than our books reveal. But the true story of architects sharing ideas across continents, of empires borrowing styles from one another, of artisans working patiently on stone and wood, is just as calming. It is a reminder that beauty does not need mystery to feel magical. The people who built these structures lived in times of great ambition, great skill, and great artistry. Their hands shaped the stone. Their minds shaped the designs. Their cultures shaped the purpose behind each building. As we wander through these architectural wonders in our imagination, the myths of Tartaria continue to drift alongside them like a soft echo. The myth and the reality coexist quietly, neither needing to replace the other. One speaks to the imagination, the other speaks to history, and together, they make the world feel richer, deeper, and full of gentle intrigue. As the world moved gradually into the era of industrialization, the quiet landscapes that had existed for centuries began to change in ways that felt both subtle and monumental. Cities that once grew at the slow pace of seasons suddenly found themselves transformed by machines, new materials, and expanding populations. Streets were widened, railways cut through open fields. Rivers were redirected to make room for factories and bridges. And as these shifts took place, countless older structures, some grand, some humble, were rebuilt, buried, altered, or simply forgotten. To the modern eye, this transformation can resemble disappearance. It can look as though entire eras of architecture and history were swept away in a single breath. And in that sense of erasure, the myths of Tartaria and the mud flood find a quiet place to grow. Imagine standing in a small town during the late 1800s, a time when industrialization was beginning to change everything. A group of workers is tearing up the old cobblestone street, removing stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and wagon wheels. They dig deeper to lay new foundations for water pipes or gas lines, and when the trench grows wide, the soil reveals a faint outline of an older road beneath. It is darker, compacted, almost melted into the earth. This lower layer is not a mystery. It is simply the memory of a past pathway. But for someone looking at it centuries later, seeing only a photograph without context, it might seem like evidence of a buried world. And in the absence of explanation, imagination quietly steps in. Throughout the 19th century, many cities raised their street levels to combat flooding or to modernize public works. Chicago, for example, famously elevated entire blocks of buildings by several feet. Workers used thousands of jacks to lift structures while new foundations were built underneath. Photographs from that time show sidewalks being raised, windows disappearing below street level, and basements becoming half-buried rooms. This process, though methodical and well-documented, created landscapes that appear today as though they have risen naturally, leaving old buildings sunken below. Similar changes happen in parts of Russia, Central Asia, and Europe, where fires devastated entire districts, and the rebuilding process layered new streets atop old ones. Cities are living organisms, constantly reshaping themselves. Fires erase old wooden structures. Floods deposit layers of silt and mud. Wars destroy sections that are later rebuilt differently. Over centuries, these cycles create uneven ground. patches of old foundations mixed with new construction. A building that once stood proudly at street level might now appear strangely low. A doorway might lead downward instead of outward. These quiet transformations happen slowly, unnoticed by the people living through them, but they leave behind signs that puzzle later generations. Industrialization accelerated all of this. Factories needed stable land, so hills were leveled. Rail lines required flat terrain, so valleys were filled in. Cities needed sanitation, so new systems were built beneath the streets, raising everything above them. When seen through an industrial lens, the world becomes layered, old humanity covered by new progress. Entire neighborhoods ended up buried beneath railroads, docks, or modern foundations. Over time, people forgot what had once stood there. The arrival of mass production also changed building styles. Older, ornate architecture gave way to simpler, more functional designs. Brick and stone structures were replaced with steel frames, glass facades, and reinforced concrete. For centuries, cities had cherished detailed craftsmanship. The gentle curve of a column, the careful carving of a stone arch, the delicate molding along a roofline. But industrialization shifted priorities. Function replaced ornament. Efficiency replaced artistry. And as that happened, the architectural harmony that once connected Europe, Russia, and Central Asia began to fade. The new world looked different from the old, and the contrast made the older buildings feel even more mysterious. To someone wandering through a city today, it can feel as though the older structures belong to another age entirely, maybe even another civilization. Their details look too elaborate, their materials feel too permanent, and their proportions seem almost surreal when compared to modern design. These differences fuel the idea that an advanced, forgotten civilization once existed. A civilization whose masterpieces were partially buried or altered during the industrial age. But the truth, though quieter, is just as intriguing. The beauty of those older structures came from generations of artisans working with care, using techniques that were gradually lost or replaced as technology advanced. Industrialization also brought migration. Populations exploded. Cities swelled with new residents searching for work. In the process, old districts were demolished to make way for wider streets, new housing and public utilities. Ancient walls, markets, and homes were swallowed by the growing urban body. Their absence created gaps in collective memory, making it easy to believe that something significant had vanished. Nature played its part as well. Earthquakes, landslides, and plain weathering gradually swallowed fragments of older cities. Vegetation reclaimed ruins. Soil drifted over abandoned foundations. Rivers shifted course, burying structures in silt. When these layers are revealed centuries later, they can seem like traces of a cataclysm, when in reality, they were the product of slow, patient processes that unfolded over ages. The industrial age, with all its rapid progress, acted like a tide rising slowly over ancient sands. Older ways of building, living, and traveling were overshadowed by machines, railways, and engines. Entire landscapes changed shape. And in the spaces left behind, between the past that was lost and the present that feels incomplete, myths naturally took root. The idea of a vanished world, a buried civilization, or a forgotten empire, like Tartaria, appeals to the imagination because it fills the silence left by centuries of rapid change. It offers a poetic explanation for the architectural contrast we see, the hidden layers beneath cities, and the sense that something grand once stood where modern buildings now rise. And even if these myths are not literal, they speak softly to a deeper truth, that history is layered, that time reshapes the world gently and continually, and that every city holds memories beneath its streets, memories of people, cultures, and structures that played their part before fading quietly into the background. As the world stepped softly into the digital age, a quiet transformation took place, one that had nothing to do with empires rising or falling, nothing to do with armies marching across plains. Instead, it happened through screens, keyboards, and the gentle hum of online conversation. The myth of Tartaria, once a fading echo on old maps, began a new life through the countless minds browsing the internet late at night. It drifted through forums, YouTube videos, comment sections, archived photographs, and scanned documents, slowly weaving itself into modern imagination, not through force, but through curiosity, not through certainty, but through possibility. Imagine someone sitting alone at their desk late in the evening, the world quiet around them. They click on an old photograph, a sepia-toned image of a grand building with huge columns and wide archways. The details are softened by age, and part of the structure seems to sink below the level of the street. The person leans closer, wondering why the building looks like that, why the lower windows appear half-buried. The question lingers, gentle and persistent. Then, another click brings them to a forgotten map, showing a vast region labeled Tartary. The letters stretch across half of Asia, their lines bold and confident despite the map's inaccuracy. From curiosity, a spark forms, and in the quiet of the night, that spark becomes the beginning of a story, not a proven truth, but an idea worth exploring. This is how modern Tartaria theory spread, not through declarations or dramatic revelations, but through countless soft, individual moments of wonder. Someone finds an old postcard. Someone else finds a newspaper clipping. A third person watches a documentary that asks questions rather than giving answers. Slowly, these fragments gather together across digital spaces, like dust particles drifting in a sunbeam, forming shapes that feel meaningful even if they remain uncertain. Online communities gave this curiosity a home. Forums became places where people shared images of unusual architecture, tall doorways, ornate facades, deep foundations. Others contributed stories about cities built on top of older cities, about forgotten regions absorbed by empires, about maps whose borders didn't match the world we know today. None of the people sharing these ideas needed to be historians. They simply needed to be curious. And curiosity, when shared gently, is enough to create a collective sense of discovery. In this environment, the idea of Tartaria found new forms. Some imagined it as a grand empire with technology far ahead of its time. Others believed it was a network of cultures connected by a shared architectural style. Some saw it as a poetic metaphor for forgotten civilizations. And many saw it simply as an intriguing possibility, something that stirred the imagination without demanding absolute belief. The internet allowed these perspectives to coexist peacefully. Someone might post an image of a building with unusually large windows. Another might respond with a historical explanation. A third person might share a theory suggesting the building was part of a lost civilization. The conversation would continue softly, drifting between fact and speculation, never needing to settle on a single answer. It was not about proving something. It was about exploring something. Old maps became a special focus of fascination. Digitized atlases from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries displayed Great Tartary with sweeping confidence, even though the mapmakers lacked precise knowledge. To the modern eye, seeing a massive region labeled with one mysterious name can feel deeply compelling. People wonder why such a large place disappeared from modern maps. They wondered who lived there, why its name faded, and whether something significant had been forgotten. These questions flowed gently, forming the backbone of countless discussions. At the same time, architecture played a central role in fueling the theory's rebirth. Photographs of elaborate 19th century buildings, domed, arched, decorated with intricate stonework, began circulating widely online. Many people felt these structures looked too advanced, too harmonious, or too perfectly crafted for the timelines provided by history textbooks. When seen without context, such buildings can appear like remnants of a lost age, and this impression grew stronger the more images were shared. Videos began to appear, narrated in calm, speculative tones. They invited viewers to relax, to imagine, to consider whether the past contained stories that modern scholars had overlooked. These videos did not force belief. Instead, they created a gentle environment for curiosity, a place where old photographs, forgotten maps, and unexplained architectural details could linger together, forming a soft cloud of questions. The psychological appeal is understandable. In a world filled with fast answers and constant information, the idea of a quiet mystery feels refreshing. Tartaria became, for many, a symbol of that mystery, a reminder that history is not always as complete as it seems, that there are gaps and silences worth exploring. It allowed people to feel connected to a larger timeline, to imagine themselves as part of a story still unfolding. The spread of the theory also reflects a deeper human longing, the desire for connection with the past. Many people feel a sense of nostalgia for eras they never lived through. They admire the craftsmanship of older buildings, the elegance of classical architecture, the slower rhythms of pre-industrial life. Tartaria, in its modern form, became a vessel for these feelings, a gentle projection of longing placed upon a forgotten name from old maps. Yet, as these ideas circulated, they remained soft and fluid. No single narrative dominated. Some saw Tartaria as a global civilization. Others viewed it as a misunderstood region. Still others saw it as a metaphor for forgotten or the overlooked. This diversity kept the theory alive not as a fixed claim, but as an ongoing conversation. And because the internet is an endless archive of images, diagrams, essays, and stories, Tartaria continued to grow as a myth, woven gently through millions of digital threads. In this way, the global spread of Tartaria theories mirrors the very essence of the myth itself, broad, undefined, shaped by imagination rather than certainty. It drifts across borders and languages, just as the old name once drifted across continents on ancient maps. And in the quiet spaces of the internet, where people search for meaning late at night, the myth continues to evolve, offering comfort, intrigue, and the soft promise that there may still be mysteries waiting to be discovered. As the world entered the age of digitization, something quiet and remarkable happened to forgotten maps of earlier centuries. Atlases that had once gathered dust on the shelves of old libraries were scanned, preserved, and uploaded into online archives. Fragile papers, whose edges were yellowed and soft with age, suddenly found new life as high-resolution images that anyone, anywhere, could examine closely. With a simple click, the world could zoom into faded coastlines, handwritten labels, and vast regions shaded with colors that no longer match the modern world. In this gentle resurrection of old cartography, the idea of Tartaria found another breath, another echo, one carried not by the hands of explorers, but by the quiet curiosity of digital wanderers searching through the past. Imagine scrolling through one of these digital maps late at night, the glow of the screen illuminating your room. You tilt your head slightly as you read the unfamiliar words. There, across a sweeping portion of northern Asia, you see a simple label written confidently in old script, Tartary. The letters seem to stretch like a shadow across the land, filling in spaces where the mapmaker had little information. The ink is ornate, the boundaries unclear, the shapes imperfect. Yet the impression is strong, almost hypnotic. It suggests a massive region, perhaps even a mighty civilization, even though the map itself offers only the gentlest hints. This moment, shared by thousands of people online, became the soft spark for renewed interest in the forgotten term. Digitized maps provide a strange kind of comfort in their inaccuracies. Their coastlines wobble. Their mountains lean slightly at odd angles. Their river paths curve with imprecision. But these imperfections are what make them magical. Modern maps are crisp, clean, and certain, but old maps carry the warmth of human effort. Ink strokes made by hands that tried their best with limited knowledge. When people explore these maps digitally, they step into the world of those earlier cartographers. They feel the uncertainty, the creativity, and the gentle assumptions that shaped every line. This emotional connection opens the door to curiosity about the regions labeled most vaguely. And so, as millions of maps from centuries past became available online, people began to notice the same pattern repeated again and again. Tartary, Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The recurrence felt significant, even though the label had been nothing more than a placeholder for the unknown. Without the historical context explaining that map makers frequently fill blank spaces with broad names, many modern viewers interpret these labels as evidence of a forgotten empire. The digital age turned these misconceptions into questions, and the questions into discussions that wandered freely across the internet. Just as importantly, digital magnification allowed people to examine maps more closely than ever before. Small details, a cluster of mountains, a lonely river, a tiny illustrated animal, gain new meaning when viewed at high resolution. Someone might zoom into a map from 1650 and notice a drawing of a camel or a caravan placed somewhere in the middle of the steppe. Another might see a fortress symbol beside an old trade route. Others zoom into map margins filled with decorative flourishes, cherubs blowing wind across the ocean, see creatures curling beneath ships, ornate compass roses pointing north with quiet certainty. These artistic touches encourage contemplation. They feel mysterious, symbolic, even magical. And in this quiet enchantment, the idea of Tartaria grows peacefully in the imagination. Through digital archives, people also began comparing maps from different centuries side by side. They noticed how the borders of Tartary shifted. On some maps, the region was enormous, stretching from Eastern Europe to the edge of the Pacific. On others, it was smaller, broken into several parts. Sometimes the label sat near Mongolia. Other times it hovered above Siberia. Seeing these variations caused some to assume that Tartaria must have been an empire that faded over time, shrinking until it disappeared altogether. Few realized that the variations reflected nothing more than evolving European misunderstandings. But the emotional impact of watching a region appear, shrink, and vanish across maps created a soft, dreamy sense of mystery. The digital age also brought new tools that allowed people to overlay old maps onto modern ones. These overlays rarely aligned perfectly, and the distortions fueled even more speculation. A coastline might be drawn too far south. A mountain range might appear shifted east. A river might curve in a direction that seems impossible today. These combined inaccuracies, viewed without historical context, contribute to the peaceful but powerful belief that a forgotten past lies beneath the modern world, waiting to be rediscovered. As more people explored these maps online, entire communities formed around the shared experience of discovery. They exchanged screenshots of old atlases, highlighted strange details, and discussed the shifting boundaries of the mysterious Tartary. The conversations flowed softly, often late at night, as people found comfort in the idea that the world still held unsolved mysteries. For many, the digital archives became a place of mental rest, a space where the imagination could wander without the pressure of certainty. The digitization of maps also inspired deeper questions about how history is recorded. Why did map makers choose certain names? Why did they leave some regions blank while filling others with details? Why did the name Tartary appear so frequently and last so long on European charts? These questions encouraged gentle contemplation rather than rigid debate. The unknown became a canvas for thought, and the maps themselves became quiet storytellers, whispering of distant lands, forgotten travelers, and centuries of shifting understanding. In this calm exploration, the digital age gave Tartaria a renewed presence, not as a proven civilization, but as a symbol of the vast space between history and imagination. The maps do not declare answers. They simply present forms, lines, curves, names that invite viewers to wonder. And in a world where many things feel certain, that soft invitation carries a comforting sense of escape. There is something deeply human about the way we are drawn to the idea of forgotten civilizations, hidden histories, and grand worlds that existed long before our own. This quiet fascination has followed humanity across centuries. It appears in ancient legends whispered beside fires, in myths carried by migrating peoples, in stories told to children at night, and now in the digital discussions of strangers searching old archives. The longing for lost civilizations does not come from a desire to replace history, but from a softer, more intimate place, a wish to connect with something vast and mysterious, to feel that the world once contained wonders that slipped gently out of reach. Tartaria, in its modern mythic form, becomes one of these comforting mysteries, a symbol for the stories we imagine living beneath the surface of recorded time. To understand why people feel drawn to such myths, imagine sitting by a quiet river at dusk. The day is ending, and the sky begins to darken. The water reflects soft streaks of orange and pink. In that stillness, your thoughts drift effortlessly. You wonder about the people who once sat by this river hundreds, even thousands of years ago. What did they believe? What did they build? What did they lose? These questions awaken a gentle sense of wonder, not rooted in fear or urgency, but in the soft desire to feel connected to something beyond the immediate moment. That sensation, quiet, deep, and reflective, is the heart of our fascination with lost civilizations. Human beings have always held on to stories of vanished worlds. Atlantis, swallowed by the sea. Lemuria, drifting beneath the waves. Hyperborea, located beyond the northern winds. Shambhala, hidden somewhere in the mountains of Asia. These stories persist not because they are proven, but because they speak to something in us. They offer the idea of a world larger than our own understanding, where beauty, wisdom, or mystery existed long before we began keeping careful records. Tartaria becomes a modern addition to this timeless list, a name revived from old maps, softened by imagination, and placed gently among these ancient legends. Part of the appeal comes from the sense that history holds gaps, quiet spaces where details were never written down, or where records were lost to time, weather, or conflict. We know there are civilizations we have only partly uncovered, cities still buried beneath layers of earth, languages not yet decoded. In that subtle uncertainty, the imagination finds room to breathe. When people encounter architectural mysteries, strange photographs, or forgotten map labels, they feel a tug of curiosity. The gaps become invitations, calling them to explore ideas that history books may not fully address. Another part of this fascination lies in nostalgia for craftsmanship and beauty. When people see old structures built with precision, artistry, and care, they sense connection to earlier ways of living, slower, more deliberate, more connected to human hands. Modern life, fast and efficient, often lacks the intricate elegance of historical architecture. And so, when individuals see ornate stonework, towering columns, or grand facades from the 19th century, they imagine a civilization that valued beauty in a way we no longer do. This feeling can lead the mind to create stories of an advanced society that vanished, leaving behind the quiet remains of its artistry. There is also the gentle psychological comfort that mystery provides. In a world filled with constant information, where nearly every question has a quick answer, mystery becomes a kind of refuge. It offers a space where the mind can wander without pressure, without deadlines, and without the need for certainty. Thinking about lost civilizations allows people to step into a dreamlike realm, where possibilities expand and reality softens. The story of Tartaria thrives in this space, offering not answers, but questions that feel expansive and serene. Curiosity about forgotten civilizations also reflects a deeper longing for meaning. People often wonder where humanity comes from, what ancient knowledge may have been lost, and how many stories remain hidden beneath the surface of our modern world. Lost civilization myths provide a comforting sense that we are connected to a grand past, that life did not begin with the present moment, but stretches far behind us in a long, poetic narrative. The idea of Tartaria, interpreted as a forgotten realm, becomes a soothing thread in that narrative, suggesting that history is not simply a collection of linear facts, but a living tapestry woven from both memory and imagination. There is a gentle beauty in believing that the past held greatness we no longer remember. Even if these beliefs are not historically accurate, they carry emotional truth. They remind us that human beings are capable of extraordinary creativity, resilience, and innovation. When people imagine Tartaria as a realm of majestic architecture and lost technologies, they are expressing admiration for human potential, past, present, and future. They are dreaming of a world where beauty and knowledge flourish together, where people built with purpose and live deeply connected to their environment. The fascination also reflects a yearning for unity. Many modern myths imagine lost civilizations as peaceful, harmonious societies, untouched by the divisions and complexities of the modern world. Tartaria, in these interpretations, becomes a symbol of a unified human past, a world where people shared architecture, culture, or technology before being scattered by time. Whether or not such unity ever existed does not diminish the emotional appeal. The myth becomes a gentle vision of what humanity could be, a reminder of shared possibility. And perhaps the deepest reason people are drawn to lost civilizations is the universal human desire for wonder. From childhood, we carry a soft longing for the mysterious, for treasure maps, hidden worlds, ancient ruins overgrown with vines. These dreams stay with us into adulthood, even if they become quiet, tucked away beneath responsibilities and routines. When people stumble across maps labeled with Great Tartary, or images of buildings with buried lower floors, or traces of forgotten architecture, that childhood sense of mystery is rekindled. It rises like a gentle tide, reminding them that the world is still full of things we do not fully understand. The modern fascination with Tartaria is not just about the past. It is also about what the past represents, a canvas for imagination, a space for wonder, a bridge between what we know and what we feel. The story invites people to slow down, to question softly, to explore gently. It blends history with wistfulness, reality with dream, fact with possibility. And in that blending lies a quiet magic that keeps the idea alive. When people speak softly about Tartaria today, comparing to ancient legends and forgotten realms, they are participating in a tradition far older than the myth itself. For as long as humans have been telling stories, they have looked beyond the edges of the known world and imagined places filled with wonder, places that shimmered with possibility, places where the rules of ordinary life faded, replaced by the quiet promise of something larger, older, or more profound. Tartaria, in this sense, finds its place among a long line of myths: Atlantis, Lemuria, Hyperborea, Shambhala, each one a reflection of humanity's desire to understand the unknown and find meaning in the vast spaces that history leaves untouched. Imagine a time thousands of years ago, when the world felt enormous and the horizon was a boundary filled with mystery. People sat by fires under open skies, listening to elders speak of lands hidden beneath the ocean or realms tucked beyond the mountains. These stories were not meant to deceive. They were meant to comfort, to inspire, to give shape to the unseen. They allowed people to feel connected to something larger than their immediate surroundings. These myths were woven with care, passed from voice to voice, drifting through generations like gentle winds. Atlantis, perhaps the most famous of these stories, was first described by Plato as a powerful, advanced society that vanished in a single night. It was not meant as a literal account, but as a philosophical metaphor, a way to reflect on the fragility of civilizations. Yet the idea captured human imagination for millennia. People searched for Atlantis in the sea, in stories, and in their dreams. They felt drawn to the possibility that an ancient world full of wisdom and beauty had existed and then slipped quietly beyond reach. Similarly, Hyperborea emerged in Greek writings as a land of eternal spring, located far beyond the northern winds. Its people lived in harmony, untouched by conflict or hardship. This myth echoed the longing for peace, for a place where life moved at a gentle pace. It was less a geographical location and more a yearning shaped into story. In Asia, the legend of Shambhala took root, an ancient kingdom said to be hidden deep within the Himalayan mountains, visible only to those with pure hearts and clear minds. It was not a physical place so much as a spiritual aspiration, a reminder that enlightenment and harmony were destinations within reach of spirit, if not afoot. Lemuria, another mysterious realm, was imagined as a vanished continent that once connected distant cultures across the oceans. It spoke to the deep, human hope that ancient civilizations might have been connected in ways we have forgotten. What connects all these myths is not evidence but emotion. They arise from the quiet spaces left between fragments of truth. They inhabit the areas where human curiosity meets human longing. Tartaria, revived in modern times through old maps and architectural mysteries, slips into the same gentle category. It becomes a place not defined by borders or dates, but by feeling, a soft echo of something that might have been. Part of the reason these myths persist is that human memory has limits. History is built for what has been written down, preserved, or discovered. But much of the human past has vanished into the soil, dissolved in rivers, burned in fires, or simply faded in the silence of time. There are more lost stories than remembered ones, more unnamed civilizations than recorded ones. In this vast absence, myths help create a bridge between what we know and what we sense. They are not replacement for history. They are reflections of the human imagination seeking texture in its own gaps. When Tartaria appears in conversations today, it is often as a symbol of the forgotten, a suggestion that maybe the world once held wonders we have not fully acknowledged. This idea resonates because it mirrors the pattern found in other myths. Each myth carries a gentle message, that human history is wider, deeper, and more mysterious than the surface of modern knowledge suggests. Whether or not these places existed as described is less important than what they represent. The longing for connection to ancient wisdom and the quiet recognition of our place within a vast timeline. Another reason Tartaria fits easily among older myths is the way it inspires questions rather than answers. Myths like Atlantis and Hyperborea invite people to wonder. They do not demand certainty. They leave room for possibility. for contemplation, for soft thinking in the quiet hours of the night. Tartaria does the same. It invites people to explore old maps, forgotten ruins, and architectural curiosities. It encourages a slow engagement with history, not as a rigid timeline, but as a living mystery filled with echoes. There is also a universal quality that these myths share, the idea of a golden age, a time when life was more harmonious or more advanced, depending on the story. Many ancient cultures have legends about such an era. The Satya Yuga in Hindu tradition, the Age of Cronus in Greek myth, the early dynasties of China remembered as times of perfect governance. Tartaria, interpreted as a great unified civilization, becomes a modern version of this longing. It suggests that somewhere in humanity's past lies an age when people built with elegance, lived with ingenuity, and connected with a sophistication that later generations forgot. This longing does not imply dissatisfaction with the present. Rather, it reflects hope that human beings have always been capable of greatness, of creativity, of deep cultural harmony. The myth becomes an affirmation of human potential. Another theme linking Tartaria to ancient myths is the idea of disappearing worlds. Civilizations do end through wars, natural disasters, migrations, or gradual transformation. Cities are buried, languages die, traditions fade. In this natural cycle of rise and fall, myths take root because they help explain the silence left behind. When people see ruins overgrown with vegetation or structures partly buried beneath city streets, they feel the gentle tug of forgotten stories. Myths step into that space with compassion, offering meaning where memory is thinned. And finally, all these myths, including Tartaria, highlight a simple truth, that human imagination is not a flaw but a gift. It allows us to see the world not only as it is, but as it might have been. It encourages us to listen for whispers in the stones, to honor the beauty of what we do not yet understand, and to approach the unknown with curiosity instead of fear. Tartaria sits quietly among these myths, not demanding belief, but offering companionship to the mind that wanders softly through history's shadows. It belongs to the same gentle family of stories that remind us the past is larger than we can ever fully grasp, and that sometimes the most meaningful truths are the ones we explore in the calm, reflective moments of imagination. As the days and nights passed, the giants' understanding of their surroundings continued to deepen, transforming their movements into a quiet exploration of both the natural world and their own growing awareness. Alcyonius, traversing the open plains, began to sense the subtle textures of the land beneath him in ways that went beyond mere touch. Each ripple of grass, each gentle sway of a tree, and each minor shift in the soil spoke to him of the world's readiness to respond to his presence. Streams bent gently, accommodating his steps without rushing or spilling over their banks, and the air seemed to move in anticipation of his massive form, adjusting quietly around him. In this meditative awareness, he realized that the earth was not simply a passive stage for his movements. It was an active participant, a living presence that guided and informed him. Porphyrion, climbing cliffs and traversing jagged ridges, found himself increasingly attuned to the delicate currents of wind and weather. The movement of air around him provided information, revealing hidden ledges, subtle variations in the rock, and even the presence of other giants moving across the distant horizon. Clouds shifted gently above, forming patterns that seemed to acknowledge his passage, and distant birds adjusted their flight in concert with his shadow. Every motion became a dialogue with the world, a lesson in harmony and balance, teaching him that even the most immense strength required patience, observation, and respect for the environment. In these quiet moments, he learned that power was not only measured by size or force, but by the awareness and intentionality behind each action. Enceladus, moving through dense forests, deep valleys, and hidden caves, remained closely connected to the subtle vibrations of the imprisoned titans below the earth. These tremors carried more than raw energy. They were echoes of history, memories of struggle, and traces of knowledge that had been preserved for eons. He allowed himself to be guided by these faint signals, integrating them into his understanding of the world above. The Titan's presence reminded him that restraint, patience, and careful observation were as important as raw power, for even immense strength could be tempered or redirected by wisdom and awareness. Enceladus began to see his role as more than a mere participant in the world. He was a bridge between the forces below and the movements above, a living connection between past and present. The smaller giants, though less individually imposing, continued to shape the environment subtly with their movements. Forests adapted to their presence, streams adjusted their flows, and wildlife learned to coexist with these enormous beings. Each step they took was deliberate and measured, contributing to the growing awareness that the giants were more than a collection of isolated forces. They were a network of consciousness, interconnected through movement, energy, and shared understanding. Their silent coordination extended across vast distances, forming an intricate tapestry of presence that reflected Gaia's enduring patience and quiet wisdom. From the heights of Olympus, the gods watched with attentive serenity. Zeus noted the growing sophistication of the giants' coordination, observing the way subtle vibrations and energies conveyed information across distances. Athena, ever strategic, mapped these interactions mentally, considering the implications for both the present and the future. Apollo, attuned to the subtle variations of sunlight across plains, rivers, and mountains, observed the patterns created by the giants' movements, discerning a rhythm that hinted at intelligence and restraint. Artemis, watching the interplay of moonlight and shadows, felt a similar sense of coordination, noticing how the giant adapted to the natural world and to each other's presence. Even minor spirits and elemental forces participated in this quiet observation, reinforcing the network of awareness between Olympus, the giants, and the living earth below. As this awareness grew, the giants began to anticipate one another's movements in ways that went beyond simple reaction. Alcyoneus could feel Porphyrion's approach long before he was visible, adjusting his own pace and position to harmonize with the collective flow. Enceladus, attuned to both the earth below and the giant around him, moved with a sense of timing and consideration that reflected an emerging understanding of strategy. Even the smaller giants responded to these subtle cues, adjusting their paths and rhythms to maintain coherence and unity. This quiet coordination, invisible to mortal eyes, transformed the giants from solitary wanderers into a connected, thoughtful force that interacted harmoniously with the world and each other. The land itself seemed to participate in this evolving harmony. Valleys exhaled gently as massive feet pressed down, mountains adjusted subtly to accommodate movement along their ridges, and rivers created soft eddies to accommodate the passage of immense forms. Trees, plants, and even flowers seemed to respond with gentle grace, bending without breaking, subtly guiding the giant's steps. The wind carried messages across distances, communicating shifts in presence and intention that connected one giant to another. Through these interactions, the world itself became a partner, teaching lessons in patience, balance, and the careful use of power. Meanwhile, the Olympians maintained their calm vigilance. Zeus recognized that the giants' growing coordination represented both potential and risk. Their awareness was impressive, yet the slightest misstep could disturb the delicate equilibrium of the world. Athena continued to monitor patterns, planning for the future while allowing the giants to explore their limits and develop understanding. Apollo and Artemis observed natural rhythms, noting subtle signs that might indicate both progress and imbalance. The gods' patience mirrored that of the earth, ensuring that intervention would be measured, informed, and purposeful rather than reactionary. The giants' exploration of their own capabilities also extended into reflection. They began to understand the relationships between strength, patience, and consequence. Alcyoneus tested the resilience of the plains beneath his feet, noting how far he could push without creating destruction. Porphyrion explored mountain ledges, understanding the interplay between air, gravity, and support. Enceladus moved through hidden valleys, absorbing lessons from the echoes of the Titans and the vibrations of the world. Each giant, through careful observation and practice, internalized the principle that power required awareness, and awareness required restraint. In these quiet days, the giants were no longer simply enormous beings moving across the world. They became conscious participants in a living, dynamic system. Their presence influenced and was influenced by the land, the Titans, and each other, while Olympus watched patiently from above. Gaia's enduring influence beneath the earth, the faint echoes of the Titans, and the growing coordination among the giants created a complex network of relationships and understanding, a living prelude to the events that would eventually culminate in the Gigantomachy. The stage was being set not through conflict, but through reflection, awareness, and the slow, deliberate weaving of connections that would define the story yet to unfold.